next 2 weeks, we'll be discussing the Japanese Canadians in British Columbia, who until the last war formed a sizable minority group. In some ways, their history has been paralleled by other ethnic groups, but in many ways, it's been unique. The first noticeable influx of Japanese into the province came in the 1890s, and by 1901, there were over 5,000 of them here. It should be noted at the same time, too, there were over 3 times this number of Chinese. They had come in earlier, first to work in the gold mines, then later on the construction of the CPR. But by the time the Japanese started their immigration, these jobs were no longer available. And so it was that many of them returned to their original trade, that of fishermen, harvesting the rich runs of Pacific salmon on the west coast. A few of them, unaccustomed to the sea, turned to laboring jobs in sawmills and in logging camps. And a few of them went into the businesses and the professions. It was the language difficulty as much as anything else that forced these early arrivals into voluntary segregation. And certain areas became predominantly Japanese, small ones like Powell Street in Vancouver, and whole communities like Steveston at the mouth of the Fraser River. Most of the people who settled in Steveston had come from the same small village in Japan. This added to their feeling of insularity in a strange land. Their village, Miyomura, in the home islands, is very old and very poor. Here the villagers are part-time fishermen, part-time farmers. Both occupations are severely limited, and for the same reason, lack of space. In Japan, even the coastal waters are divided up and allocated to certain villages, and Miyomura's fishing grounds are very small. So too with the farmlands, hemmed in as they are by steep, barren hills. No wonder that when the reports of the rich fishing in BC filtered back from the first venturesome emigrants, that so many of the Mio people went abroad. They settled in Steveston, in such numbers that we finally had the phenomenon of a Canadian town being inhabited almost entirely by people of Japanese ancestry. Fishing was the principal industry, and while the men went to sea in gill netters and trawlers, their wives and daughters worked in the canneries that lined the river bank. But despite relative prosperity, their path has not been easy in Canada. Before the first of them came here, way back in the 1880s, there was a strong anti-Oriental feeling, which was directed mainly against the Chinese. The provincial legislature urged the Dominion government time after time to restrict immigration from the Far East. The prejudice was aroused by the cheap labor offered by the Orientals, and so the Japanese fell heir to a bitter discrimination. We asked Dr. George Ishiwara, a Vancouver dentist, about the situation of the Japanese in BC before the war.
In the first place, we didn't have a franchise. We were not able to vote. In the second place, since we didn't have any franchise, we were restricted in certain line of professions or work. For instance, now, we weren't able to be lawyer, nor optometrist, and pharmacist.
None of the professions, in other words?
No, medical and dentistry work we were able to practice or to go through.
Well, what kind of occupations usually then did these people follow?
Mostly in a professional line, well, medical or dentistry, what we were able to go into, but majority of them were laborers, or some few in the skilled labor line.
Was there discrimination at the personal level as well as at the legal level?
Yes, I think they were, because, for instance, if a person who did graduate from university with a high honor were not able to go into their own certain line in economic or forestry or a special line of course that they took at the university.
But what about personal acts of discrimination? Did you ever run into anything like this?
Before the war,
yeah.
Maybe about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when the first immigrant came in, well, some of the restaurants were refused, and in certain theaters, well, we had to go up the balcony or on the side. We weren't able to go anywhere we want to in the theaters or restaurant.
Well,
Was there any distinction made between the Japanese born in Japan and the Japanese born in Canada at this time?
Do you mean before the war?
Before the war.
Before. Well, hardly, because we all look alike, whether the person is born in Japan or Canada. Well, as far as the Occidental's point of view, through their eyes, I think they couldn't differentiate the difference.
Well, this was a pretty unhappy situation. What do you think made the people want to come from Japan to Canada? What brought them here?
On account of mostly to just like any other immigrant from European country or any other part of the world,